It was raining the way it often does in Oxford, not quite with intention, but as if the sky had simply forgotten to stop. The kind of rain that doesn't force umbrellas but leaves collars damp, books smudged, and thoughts slightly undone. I remember I had drifted into Blackwell's that morning, as I often did when I had no reason to be anywhere else. There is a stillness in bookshops that appeals to those of us too easily roused by noise. The smell, half mildew, half memory, always manages to calm the nerves even when the mind resists. I found myself in the poetry section, fingering a first edition of Donne's Devotions, its pages soft-edged, the spine cracked like old knees. I flipped it open to a page I must have read a dozen times before, Batter My Heart, Three-Personed God, and it greeted me again like a former lover, unrecognizable only in how little I had changed. But what held me wasn't the poem. It was the ink, the line beneath the final stanza. Not in printed serif, but someone's cursive, slanting forward with the quiet urgency of the newly written, and still glistening as if it had only just been laid down. I touched it with the back of my index finger. It bled faintly. Not old ink, then, not even dry. She passed behind me just then, or a rustle of wool, a scarf in a shade of vermilion that suggested theatre tickets or an unfinished thesis on synesthesia. She was humming very quietly, and I could just make out the shape of it. Schubert, I think, though I couldn't place the lead. She stopped near the German philosophy shelf, her fingers hovering above Adorno as though she were trying to remember something too long unremembered. I did not speak to her. I rarely speak to strangers. Most of them carry their regrets like perfume. Faint at first, then overwhelming. I was still trying to decide whether to buy the book, and wondering who would write a line in fresh ink in a shop copy they didn't own, when my phone rang, or buzzed rather. I keep it on silent. There is something vulgar about having one's inner life interrupted by sound. Strange's name flashed across the screen, and with it came the usual sense of compromise. He didn't waste time. Tutor at St. Fritzwide's found dead this morning, locked room, door barred from the inside. Probably natural causes, but the college wants it handled quietly. I asked him if they ever wanted it handled loudly. He didn't laugh. I left the shop without the Don. I suppose I was waiting for the ink to dry, or perhaps for someone else to return and claim it. St. Fritzwide's is one of those colleges that prefers not to be noticed. Its stonework is less weathered than others, its porters less forgiving, its quad arranged with a kind of passive-aggressive neatness. The dead man, Dr. Edmund Calthorpe, had been a fellow there since 1967, classics, widower, no children. Lived in the top-floor rooms overlooking the East Cloister. I'd seen him once at a lecture on Latin elegy, a tall man with a voice that sounded like it had given up smoking, but not the bitterness that came with it. His body was found at the desk, hand still resting on a fountain pen. The ink on the final line of his manuscript was wet, oddly wet, though the heating was off and the windows shut. The coroner had just finished when I arrived. Likely cardiac, he said, though he looked uncertain. The man's face was serene. Too serene, perhaps. As if he had written his own death into the sentence and had simply ceased to be once it ended. Lewis pointed out the locked door, the unbroken glass, the untouched wine on the sideboard. It all had the logic of a sealed puzzle, the kind a child might fail to solve, not because it was difficult, but because it made too much sense. I walked around the room, pausing near the manuscript. The Latin line trailed off mid-thought. Exul in exilio. Exile in exile. I read it again. Then once more. There was a smudge at the edge of the parchment. A second fingerprint, fainter than the one on the pen, smaller. Someone else had read this, not long before he died, or not long after. I noticed, too, the inkwell had been moved slightly. Its base left a ring, faint but clear, an inch to the left of where it now sat. No one moves an inkwell unless they intend to use it, or conceal something beneath it. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the ground still held the memory. I lit a cigarette and leaned against the archway. Students passed, heads bent forward into a world that hadn't yet disappointed them. Somewhere behind me, a clock struck 11. It sounded late. The manuscript was due to be sent to a publisher at the end of the month, but endings, I've found, are rarely the parts people write honestly, especially when the ink refuses to dry. He was the sort of man who would have footnoted his own death, given the chance. Dr. Edmund Calthorpe, known among his peers for a prose style that considered ambiguity an affliction, had dedicated his life to classical finality. He disliked dangling participles, disliked unfinished arguments, and, as I would come to learn, disliked very much the idea of being misunderstood. That morning, as the rain moved off eastward and left the flagstones slick and pale as parchment, I stood in the room where his life had ended with a sentence still breathing on the page. The porter who found him spoke with a quiet that comes not from reverence, but routine. "Found the door locked at 7:30, sir. Lights still on. He never missed chapel." There was no suggestion of foul play in his voice. I've long since learned that foul play rarely announces itself. The room smelled faintly of wine and paper. The manuscript lay open as I remembered, and the sentence unfinished. Lewis was there already, flicking through the drawers as if guilt might leave itself alphabetized. I watched him lift a sealed envelope, unaddressed, unmarked, no seal, merely tucked, under a stack of corrections as if awaiting further intention. I took the chair opposite the desk and studied the bookshelves. A certain symmetry governed them, Greek tragedy on one side, Latin lyric on the other. Between them, a gap, not large, but intentional. A narrow absence where perhaps a single volume had once lived. The dust was less disturbed there. I felt no triumph in noticing it. Lewis asked whether I thought it was suicide. I told him suicide rarely uses a fountain pen, and even more rarely includes a grammatical flourish. He looked unconvinced. Most do, until the quiet begins to shout. There was something oddly formal about the way Calthorpe had been found. Slumped, yes, but not collapsed. His pen still in hand, cap placed neatly beside the inkwell. The glass of wine was untouched, though its cork lay beside it, like a small, discarded truth. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 1:17. I wound it gently and watched it tick again. No battery to fail, no symbolism to trust. Later, as we spoke to the bursar, I heard the phrase again, natural causes. I nodded, the way one nods at a funeral. Not in agreement, but in respect for the dead's preference not to be examined too closely. It was in the stairwell, descending slowly past the stained glass window that looked out over the chapel roof, that I noticed the dust on the windowsill. Lightly disturbed, a smudge only. The sort of man might leave if he paused there, watching someone below. A pattern too delicate for deliberate movement. I didn't mention it to Lewis. He wouldn't have seen it. He doesn't always see dust the way I do. In the quad, a student was rehearsing something from the Bacchae, or else misremembering it. I only caught fragments, Dionysus, madness, the laughter of women. It echoed faintly as if the stones themselves remembered a time when Latin was more than ceremony. That evening, I returned to the station and laid out the facts with the care of someone assembling a puzzle in candlelight. The locked door, the unbroken window, the wine is unopened, the unfinished manuscript. A man who liked his endings to be precise, and yet had left his own open. The Latin on the final line still troubled me, not the meaning, that was plain enough, but the voice. It didn't sound like him. There was a shift in cadence, in tone, as though someone else had lifted the pen and for one line tried to be him. I'd seen students do it, writing love letters in borrowed style. I wondered what kind of love, or loathing, would cause someone to finish a dying man's thought. And I wondered, too, whether the missing book had anything to say on the matter. Some rooms carry the breath of people long after they've gone. Not through any grand gesture of memory, but in the smaller things. The way the light lands on a faded cushion, or how a teacup sits not quite centered on its saucer. I found myself in one such room that afternoon. It belonged to Mrs. Hallowed, Calthorpe's cleaner, a woman of indeterminate age and quietly militant habits. She brewed a tea so bitter it felt more like an initiation than hospitality. She spoke with the deliberate precision of someone who disliked being contradicted and had little patience for those who did not clean behind radiators. She said he was a creature of routine. Thursdays were for letter writing. Sundays for a walk to the river. He polished his shoes before bed. Never let the wine run out. Never let the windows fog. A man of endings, she repeated, as though echoing my own unease. But it was something else she said that made me still my cup on the arm of the chair. A woman had visited once, just once, in the last 3 weeks. She didn't give her name. She wore gloves despite the warmth. She brought white lilies, not cut, but potted, stayed less than 20 minutes, spoke with him in the study, and left without so much as a cup of tea. Mrs. Hallowed had found the plant in the waste bin the next day, broken at the stem. She assumed it had fallen. I asked if he'd seemed upset. She shook her head. Not upset, exactly. Quieter. Though, she added, he'd been humming under his breath later that week. Not something he often did. She couldn't place the tune. Something light. European. I left her flat, feeling as though I'd been dusted lightly with suspicion. There are things a man hides in plain sight. A flower pot, a melody, a woman who wears gloves in June. At the station, Lewis handed me a receipt. Torn at the edge, a faint watermark across one corner. He'd found it in the wastepaper basket beside Calthorpe's desk. I took it with the usual blend of resignation and interest that characterizes most of our exchanges. The logo was faint, gold embossed, Giselle's Tea Room, Jericho, a place I knew in passing, too precious by half, all distressed wood and lavender shortbread. I went the following afternoon. The girl behind the counter wore eyeliner like punctuation marks. I showed her the receipt. She didn't need prompting. Oh, her, the lady with the gloves. Comes in Thursdays, always the same table. The one near the window, with the geranium. Orders Darjeeling. No milk, lemon slice, very thin. Has a book, always hardback, always with a sticker on the spine. Library copy, I expect. Smells like violet water. Her name, never said. She pays cash, tips well. I sat at the table she favoured and ordered the same. The lemon was too sharp. The window overlooked a side street where cyclists cut through like afterthoughts. I imagined her sitting here, alone with her book and her thoughts, and the memory of a man she might have once loved. Or never quite stopped loving. A name came to me then, unbidden, Eloise Archer. I had seen it footnoted once in an early edition of Elegies of Displacement, a monograph co-authored, or nearly so, with Calthorpe. Her name later vanished from revised editions. No explanation offered. I remembered noticing it years ago and wondering briefly at the vanishing. Back at the office, I searched through the acknowledgements of Calthorpe's earlier work. There it was, faint and formal. My thanks to Miss H. Archer for her invaluable suggestions during the preparation of Chapter 5. No further mention. But Chapter 5 had always seemed unusually lyrical, less precise, almost mournful. I ran my finger over the spine of the book, then closed it. Some people live only in the margins of others' lives, and some choose to stay there. There are libraries in Oxford that do not seem entirely of this world, places where time forgets to pass, and light falls in the same direction, year after year. The Bodleian, of course, is the grand cathedral. But there are others, smaller, dustier, and more faithful to the ghosts who still browse its shelves. I spent an afternoon in one such place, where the silence was not imposed, but inherited. I had gone looking for her, Miss Heloise Archer, in the only place I could think to find someone who'd vanished not from geography, but from citation. There had once been a photograph of her, I recalled, in the archives of St. Hilda's, a student paper feature on promising D.Phil candidates. She had stood beside a flowering wisteria in full May, eyes shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, a copy of Propertius clutched like a secret. The article was brief. Passionate scholar of Latin elegy. Particular interest in themes of absence and return. She never returned, not officially. The library records were older than most of the books, kept in a drawer with an unreliable lock, and a habit of misfiling. The borrowing slips were paper, faded lilac, with edges curled like old petals. It took a quiet hour and the goodwill of a librarian who mistrusted the police, but liked my Latin pronunciation, before I found the entry, a 4073 Exile and the Elegiac Imagination, borrower H. Archer, issued 4th of March 1974, due 18th of March 1974. Status, overdue, not missing, not returned, just overdue. It had become part of the shelves' memory, quietly unacknowledged. The book was not in the catalogue now, no digital trace. It had never been scanned into the new system, never shelved again. Either it had been stolen, misplaced, or deliberately made to vanish. I asked the librarian. She pursed her lips, then walked me down a corridor lined with medieval glass and led me into a reading room that smelled of lavender and dust. She remembered Heloise, the girl with the gloves, a very quiet kind of brilliant. Came here for hours at a time, never read with a pencil. She underlined with her fingernail softly, just enough to crease the page. Had a habit of tilting her head when she read, like she was listening to someone just out of sight. There had been some incident, the librarian said, a thesis withdrawn. Health, perhaps, or politics, or something more personal. She never came back, but she never formally left either. I sat for a while in that room. The walls were lined with volumes that had known more about human sadness than any of us ever will. Latin poetry, if one reads it honestly, is not about gods or conquest. It's about exile, the kind you choose and the kind that chooses you. A student nearby was dozing beside a pile of Cicero, his hand still holding a pen that had ceased to move hours ago. I envied him, faintly. Not for his youth, but for the way his mind could drift without guilt. As I was leaving, I paused at the return shelf, not the official one, but the small trolley near the exit, the one people use when they'd rather not be seen returning something. It held the usual debris of essays barely begun, a misfiled dictionary, an anthology of Sappho, a book of essays on interpretation and silence, and beneath them all, spine cracked, edges frayed, a copy of Exile and the Elegiac Imagination. No barcode, no library sticker, but inside, in soft pencil, a name, H. Archer, and a note, return only when remembered. I turned the pages slowly. Some were dog-eared. One held a pressed flower, so brittle it might vanish with breath. On another, a passage had been underlined. He who returns from exile returns, changed, not to the place he left, but to the place that left him. That night I walked home past St. Frideswide's, the quad quiet, and the lanterns lit low. A door opened somewhere above, then closed, The sound was gentle, not final. It was always the bright ones, the ones whose shoes clicked a little too crisply on the stone floors, whose gowns never quite brushed the dust like they ought to. I met Dr. Felix Marsh in his office overlooking the Fellows' Garden, a room that had been modernized out of recognition. Chrome fittings, recessed lighting, a sculpture of two contorted figures welded into something like intimacy. I imagined Calthorpe would have loathed it. Marsh welcomed me with a smile too neat to be sincere and gestured toward a chair made more for posture than comfort. He wore a tie the colour of late plums and had the kind of voice that had been carefully trained to hover just above condescension. Said he'd admired Edmund, of course, a scholar of the old world, fastidious, private, brilliant in that dry, unclubbable sort of way. But times had changed, hadn't they? One must adapt. I asked whether he'd read the manuscript. Marsh hesitated. Not recently, he said. He had glanced at it some years ago, so back when Calthorpe had first started to toy with the idea. A treatise on exile, wasn't it? A personal subject, by all accounts. Marsh's mouth twitched slightly at the corner. I couldn't tell if it was amusement or resentment. Often there's little difference. On his desk lay a copy of The Waste Land, annotated in a small, looping hand. A cigarette, unlit, rested beside it. A deliberate tableau he staged, I suspected, for anyone who entered. I picked up the book, flipped to the opening. A small note in pencil, in Latin, corrected a mistranslation of data. Diadavam, damiata. It was the same correction I'd seen penciled into Calthorpe's manuscript, the same loop in the D, the same hesitation before the final stroke. Too similar to be coincidence, too telling to be proof. Marsh watched me watching the book. Said he was working on a paper about mistranslation as metaphor, how some errors reveal more than fidelity ever could. I said nothing. I was beginning to suspect that Marsh understood errors rather well. I mentioned Heloise Archer, and something in his face pulled taut. Ah, yes, her. A curious episode, that. She had been promising, very promising, but there'd been complications, questions of authorship, ideas borrowed, perhaps too generously. Calthorpe had been caught in the middle. Or so Marsh understood. He smiled again, but this time it cracked slightly at the edges. I left his office with the smell of vetiver clinging to my coat and a faint ringing in my ears, the kind that follows long exposure to something out of tune. Outside, the Fellows' Garden was beginning to yellow, early for the season. A single lily stood half-bent near the sundial, its petals curled like an exhausted confession. Back at the station, I took out Calthorpe's manuscript again. That same penciled correction, so the Latin misquote, was present in the margins of Chapter 6. A faint hand, different from the main text, but threaded through it like breath through a flute. Marsh had read it, and more than once. That much was certain. Whether he had written part of it, stolen part of it, or merely envied it, that remained suspended. Lewis popped in with coffee and a vague question about motive. I didn't answer. I was still thinking about the word envy, how it's never as operatic as jealousy, never as theatrical. Envy is quieter. It watches. It mimics. It waits for the moment the original forgets itself, then slips inside the silence. Before sleep that night, I tried to read The Waste Land again. The line, April is the cruelest month, seemed unusually confident. But it wasn't that line I kept returning to. It was the one near the end. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. It sounded suddenly like something Edmund Calthorpe might have written. Or perhaps had. There are evenings in Oxford when the air itself seems soaked in ritual, the chiming of chapel bells across rooftops, the shiver of gowns in cloistered passageways, the slow procession of scholars toward port and pudding. I've always found something faintly theatrical about college dinners, everyone playing a part, even when no one remembers the script. That night, St. Friderswyds held a memorial meal for Edmund Calthorpe, or, as the warden called it in his toast, an occasion of solemn commemoration, which meant beef Wellington, a burgundy older than most of the students, and a silence that stretched too long between jokes. I sat between the Dean of Theology, who spoke in fragments like a man composing footnotes aloud, and the college archivist, who seemed allergic to any memory more recent than 1952. Felix Marsh was directly opposite. He raised his glass when I sat, a faint smile that didn't touch his eyes. He looked like a man watching someone else play his part better than he could. There was a small speech, of course. The warden read from Ovid, somewhat predictably. "Exile does not change the soul, only the sky above it," a lovely phrase and faintly ironic. I wondered if he knew Calthorpe had translated that line differently, rather defiantly, in fact. In the manuscript, he'd written exile alters the soul because it alters the silence around it. I always preferred that. Fewer stars, more truth. Afterwards, over cheese and the kind of port that leaves a gentle burn in the ribs, I drifted outside for air. Lewis found me near the sundial, tugging at his collar like a man in the wrong century, said he didn't trust any institution that polished its silver more than its windows. I reminded him that St. Friderswyds had survived a civil war and 2 vice-chancellors with artistic tendencies. It would survive one suspicious death. He shrugged, then mentioned the skylight above Calthorpe's study. Said he'd looked at it again. Slight markings near the latch. Could have been opened from the outside with effort. Maybe a student prank? Or maybe something quieter. Inside, the conversation had turned to Latin. One of the younger fellows, half pickled in claret, was arguing about the middle voice in classical Greek, that odd grammatical space where action neither flows from the subject nor entirely to it. I'd always liked the idea, a verb that happens in the liminal, neither active nor passive, like memory or guilt. I slipped back to the study, alone. The corridor smelled of polish and stale dust. The door, now unlocked, opened with a sigh. I stepped in. The light was different at night, softer, more willing. The manuscript still rested where it had been left, pages turned ever so slightly by the breeze from the cracked window. I picked it up, turned to the end. The Latin again, the final phrase, and something else. A faint indentation, barely there, at the top margin of the page. A ring, circular, not ink, not wine. I tilted it under the lamplight and saw what it was. The base of an inkwell, moved and replaced just slightly off-center. Beneath it, if one lifted gently, a small square of folded paper. I hesitated before opening it, not from fear, from something closer to reverence. It wasn't a confession, just a line, in English. She came to finish what we began, no signature, no date. The handwriting, however, was not Calthorpe's. I heard footsteps in the corridor and tucked the note into my pocket. The door creaked open and Marsh appeared, a glass in hand, feigning surprise. Said he was just paying respects, asked if I found what I was looking for. I told him I rarely did. We stood there, 2 men surrounded by the quiet debris of someone else's brilliance. He sipped his wine. I watched the way he held the glass. 2 fingers, stem tilted slightly, the kind of grip that suggested familiarity with performance. I noticed the cuff of his shirt, faint smudge of something dark like ink or chalk. He caught me looking, said something about careless laundry. I didn't reply. Some truths arrive not as facts, but as atmosphere. That night, back in my flat, I uncorked a half-finished bottle of something almost red and watched the rain return. A crossword lay unfinished on the table, clue 17 across, voice used when something happens to you but you are not the cause. I didn't write the answer, we never write alone, that I've come to understand. Even the most solitary manuscripts breathe with the echoes of conversations long since quieted, gestures left unspoken, glances that never became words. Calthorpe's manuscript, with the so-called masterwork on exile, was not a solo voice, or at least not entirely. It had another hand running beneath it, not overt, not insistent, but present, like harmony folded into melody, or regret threaded into memory. I spent the morning at the Radcliffe's smaller reading annex, hunched over the original pages of Chapter 6. There it was again, a note in the margin, slanting left, gentler than Calthorpe's own. See line 47. Emotional inversion. The handwriting matched the inscription I'd found on the long-lost elegiac imagination copy. And in a second margin, might return mean more than spatial? Think temporally or emotionally. That one was almost tender. I asked the archivist for a sample of Calthorpe's hand from 20 years ago. It was firmer then, full of certainty, like a man still arguing with the world. The annotations I'd found were nothing like that, not even close. The stroke was looser, less combative, feminine perhaps, though I dislike such assumptions. Still the evidence, faint though it was, drew its own conclusions in silence. Lewis, meanwhile, had been rooting through the contents of Calthorpe's desk again. He found a sealed envelope addressed to no one. The handwriting, not Calthorpe's, matched the annotations. Inside, folded neatly, was a single sheet of vellum paper, ivory-coloured, faintly scented with something between lavender and old books. The message was brief. You once told me exile was the truest condition of the thinking mind, but I fear you never understood that I did not choose it. I only accepted it. I gave you my words once. This time I am keeping them. No name, but no doubt. Archer. She had returned, then, not only to the manuscript, but to Calthorpe himself, perhaps not to Oxford, perhaps only to that room, to that moment. To a kind of reparation neither academic nor romantic, but something in between. A last attempt at co-authorship, not just of theory, but of a life. That note, its tone, its grief, stayed with me longer than it should have. I carried it around in my pocket like a relic, as though it might warm me through the rain. I found myself thinking of her, the woman with the gloves, the lemon tea, the vanishing name. I imagined the arguments they must have had, long ones, no doubt, elegant, bruising, not fights exactly, but dialogues with too much history between the lines. I returned to Calthorpe's rooms that afternoon, moving slower than usual. The air had changed since the night of the dinner. A faint draught pushed at the window pane, and someone had watered the ivy that curled beneath the sill. There, on the edge of the desk, sat the manuscript. But not as I had left it. The pages had shifted ever so slightly. Chapter 6 now rested on top. It was not a printer's draft, it was the original. And beneath the final paragraph, in ink darker than the rest, the same ink I'd seen still drying in the bookshop, was a new line. There is no exile from a place that never let you stay. No attribution, but it didn't need one. 2 hands had written this book. One spoke from loss, the other from longing. It was not a scholarly volume. It was an elegy, and like all elegies, it was addressed to someone who could no longer answer. I closed the manuscript, slowly. Outside, the chapel bell marked the hour, though I'd already lost track of time. Some stories, I've learned, don't end. They are simply paused between authors. It was never what was written that unsettled me. It was what wasn't What might have been had the ink not dried where it did, had the sentence been allowed its proper breath. I returned to the manuscript again, not from duty, but from something closer to compulsion. The library had catalogued it now, though begrudgingly, as if unsure whether it was a scholarly artifact or the remnant of something more private. I was shown to the reading alcove by a librarian who looked at me with the exhausted politeness of someone who disapproves of drama but understands its inevitability. The final chapter lay open. Chapter 11. The argument, such as it was, concerned the impossibility of true return, how exile reshapes not just geography but syntax. There were cross-references to Cicero, to Ovid, to a lesser-known elegy by Propertius. But what caught me, and what caught and held like a thorn, was a footnote number hovering at the edge of a phrase, anchored by nothing, a superscript 9, and no corresponding note below. I checked twice, then again. There were 8 footnotes in total, all present, all accounted for. The 9th hovered without a home, as if waiting to be written, or, more precisely, erased. Lewis would have shrugged. A clerical error, a dropped line. It happens, he'd say. But it didn't. Not in Calthorpe's work, not with a man who once corrected an entire article because a semicolon had been misused in a citation from Tacitus. He didn't leave footnotes undone, especially not in his final paragraph, especially not now. Back at the station, I retrieved the earlier drafts. The carbon copies Calthorpe had kept, stacked in orderly piles. In the penultimate version of Chapter 11, the 9th footnote was still there. It read simply, C.F. Archer, Elegiac Refractions, unpublished. It had been deliberately removed, not replaced, not rewritten, removed, as though her name had no place in the final sentence, as though the final sentence had no place for what she had written. But even deletions leave shadows. I walked to St. Hilda's through light rain, the sort that doesn't fall exactly, more of a presence in the air like an old regret. The college porter remembered Archer, just. Said she used to walk the gardens at dusk, always carried a notebook, said she smelled like ink and something floral. No one had seen her in years, but no one said she was gone either. I found her thesis, or what remained of it, in the sub-archives, half-bound, spine faded to ash grey. The Poetics of Unreturn, Elegy as Structure, a title that now felt less theoretical than confessional. A few pages had been annotated, not by her, I think, but by someone attempting to wrestle the text into compliance. Whole paragraphs had been excised. Red ink bled like reprimand through the footnotes. One note, though, had been preserved in pencil. A quiet parenthesis in the margin. Not all exile is geographical. I left the thesis on the reading desk and stood for a while at the window, watching the mist rise over the Cherwell. Students walked past in pairs, coats drawn tight, heads bowed as if listening to something just behind them. One of them for a moment had her hands in pale gloves. I blinked. She was gone. Back in my flat, I poured myself something dark and waited for it to taste like resolution. It didn't. I opened the crossword. Clue 8 down, a word unspoken yet always implied, 8 letters. I thought of the missing footnote, of names unwritten, of love undeclared. The answer came slowly. Silence. Some absences are louder than departures. I've come to believe that. Not everyone who leaves is gone, and not everyone who stays is seen. It was Lewis, oddly enough, who brought her to me again, not by name, but by address. A quiet rest home near Banbury. Ivy-covered, unassuming. The sort of place chosen by people who no longer wished to be asked about their pasts. He'd found the record buried in an alumni registry. Heloise Archer. No degrees completed, no forwarding academic post, just a line marked "residing privately" by discretion. The receptionist had a voice like starched linen and eyes that had seen the soft dismantling of many lives. She led me down a corridor of low light and good intentions and tapped lightly on a door without waiting for an answer. The room was spare. Not institutional, not warm either. A single photograph on the sill. A younger Calthorpe, unreadable in expression, and beside him a woman turned just slightly away from the camera. Not hiding, just deflecting. She looked up when I entered, and I knew her. Not from photographs, not from archival acknowledgements, but from the rhythm in Calthorpe's prose that had never been his alone. She asked if I was from the college. I said no. She nodded as though she had expected as much, said Edmund had always disliked officials. We talked. Not in confession, not even in memory, but in that soft liminal space where two people agree to let the past remain partially opaque. She said they'd begun the manuscript together, in Paris once, then again in Oxford, then not at all. She called it their palimpsest of regret, said it had grown too large, too fragile, too precise. She had come back, not to reconcile, not to accuse, but to help him finish what he no longer could, not academically, not really, just to give shape to the thing that would outlive them both. I asked if she'd seen anyone else in those days, anyone else who knew she'd come. She shook her head slowly, said there was a man who watched her from the quad once, but didn't follow. His scarf had been the college's, but his face hadn't matched any of the old staff. She thought perhaps he was new, or perhaps he wasn't new at all. Then with a kind of soft reluctance, she opened the drawer beside her bed and handed me a letter, unsealed, unsent, in her hand. Addressed simply to E, it read like music, half apology, half revision. She hadn't killed him. Of that, I was certain before she even said it. She didn't need to. She had already left him once, and it had nearly undone him. The second time, she had only returned long enough to give him the ending he hadn't known how to write. The real one. The silent one. I rose to leave, and she said something very quietly, something I've only half understood even now. She said, "Exile isn't always punishment, Inspector. Sometimes it's protection." Outside, the sky had bruised into that peculiar shade between dusk and morning. A child's voice drifted from somewhere, a hymn, off-key and sweet. I walked to the car without looking back. She had never really left Oxford, just rearranged her absence until no one knew where to place it. There are kinds of silence that aren't absence, but choreography. The wine glass on the sideboard, untouched, yet polished to gleam. The curtain pulled a few inches too far, just enough to cast doubt on whether it was opened from within. And the skylight, not broken, not forced, but unlatched. Openable, if one knew how. If one had stood on the roof before. If one had planned not to be seen entering by the door. Lewis had gone back to the scene with a younger officer, someone with knees willing enough for the roof. The ivy had grown in thick tangles near the dormers. Easy enough to grip, hard to explain. But there had been a disturbance, faint indentations in the leadwork, a scrape on the slate, and something more decisive. A single thread of wool snagged on the corner of the skylight latch. I still carry a torch, though I pretend it's for Lewis. I brought it to the porter's office that afternoon and asked to see the college scarves left behind by past students, forgotten dons, visiting lecturers. They keep them in a drawer beside the missing umbrellas. A kind of small graveyard of affiliation. One was grey with a faded crimson border, fraying badly at one end. I rubbed the thread between thumb and forefinger, wool, loosely spun, a match in texture, if not proof. Marsh had worn something similar the night of the dinner. The collar of his coat was tailored just high enough to conceal it. Not a crime, of course. Nothing ever is, until too late. Back in Calthorpe's study, I asked for the wineglass. It had been rinsed, foolishly. But the lab still found 2 sets of prints, one dominant, one partial. Calthorpe's and another they couldn't place. I knew whose they weren't. Heloise's. She had worn gloves. I returned to Marsh's office just after the close of evensong, when the bells still hung faintly in the walls. He poured himself whiskey this time, not wine. Said he preferred its honesty. I didn't sit. I asked about the manuscript. He said he'd never read the final draft. I told him it was curious then that he had corrected a misquote in Chapter 6 that hadn't been included until the week before Calthorpe died. His eyes held mine for just a second too long, then drifted. Said perhaps he'd seen it in passing. They had exchanged drafts over the years, hadn't they? Ideas had been borrowed, shared, refined. No harm in that, I said no, not if one of them was alive. He smiled, thinly, told me I was poetic for a policeman. I told him I was lonely for one. There was a pause then, the sort that invites either violence or truth. Marsh offered neither. Only silence and a top-up of his own drink. Said he hoped the college wouldn't sensationalize things. Edmund had been a complex man, reclusive, easily tired. The manuscript had demanded more of him than was perhaps fair. I left without another word. There are some performances that deserve only quiet. That evening, I reread Chapter 11 once more. The final paragraph now seemed overwritten. The syntax stiffer, more performative, as though it had been adjusted after the fact by someone trying to imitate Calthorpe's voice. Trying too hard. The note I'd found under the inkwell, she came to finish what we began, could have been Heloise's, but the hand had trembled. Slight hesitation in the tail of the G, not hers. I compared it again to Marsh's annotations in The Wasteland, a near match. Guilt, I've learned, rarely enters through the front door. It creeps in through skylights, it drinks from your glass, it writes your last paragraph and calls it mercy. That night I sat by the window, long after the crossword had been abandoned. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the softness of withheld speech. It was Lewis who delivered the final line, though he didn't know it. He'd come in, half-soaked, from a burst of September rain, holding the forensic report like a pub menu he didn't particularly want to read. There were prints, yes. On the wineglass, the inkwell, the latch of the skylight, Calthorpe's, Marsh's, no strangers, no gloves this time. And that, I think, was the mistake, because Marsh had assumed subtlety could be reconstructed, that if you mimic the rhythm, the rest will follow. But Calthorpe's last paragraph, the one written in the final hour of his life, or the first hour of someone else's alibi, bore the weight of a hand trying to sound like closure. It didn't. I asked to speak with Marsh again, not formally. No charges, no interview room, just 2 men on opposite sides of a desk late in the evening when the city has begun to fold its arms and wait for something to happen. He poured whiskey without asking, the kind that coats the silence rather than cuts it. I said the skylight had been used. He said that would be difficult to prove. I said it already had been. A pause, a sip, a small exhalation. He asked what I thought had happened. Not in tone of confession, but one of literary critique. I told him the manuscript had not been finished by the man who started it, that the pen had changed voices, that the footnote had vanished, that the wineglass had been placed, not drunk from, that death had come too neatly and from the wrong angle. He looked out the window, said he only wanted it to be done, that Calthorpe had been obsessed, had become something shriveled, knotted around an idea that no longer lived. Said he had merely Here he hesitated, intervened. Not killed, number, but perhaps guided. I didn't need a confession. I'd stopped needing one 3 days ago. But it was something else he said that stayed with me. He said some people mistake scholarship for permanence. But even ideas can rot. I left him in the dark, the desk lamp still burning over the paper he pretended to read. The whiskey untouched now, the glass trembling slightly in the shape of his refusal. Back at the station, I pulled the manuscript from the evidence locker. The final footnote, the one that never was, still haunted the margin. I penciled it in myself, softly, without pressing too hard. Just one word, loss, not fact, not proof, but the only conclusion that felt earned. I thought of Eloise Archer then, not in the rest home, not in exile, but in the pages that still bore her phrasing like a faint perfume. She had loved him once, perhaps still did, perhaps enough to return, perhaps enough not to fight when someone else didn't want her words there. There was a message on my phone. Strange? Asking when I'd be closing the file. I didn't answer. Some endings are too quiet to be filed. Outside, Oxford slept the way it always does, uneasily beneath layers of stone and citation. Somewhere, a clock tower struck 11. I reached for the crossword on my desk, clue 10 across, what remains when the author is forgotten, but the page still breathes 7 letters. I didn't write it down, but I knew the answer. Footnote. Blackwell still had the Don, same shelf, same lean to the binding, the same whisper of dust between the pages. I stood there longer than I meant to, fingers resting against the spine, reluctant to open it again. The ink from before, that glistening, deliberate underlining of Batter My Heart, had long since dried. Or perhaps it had been wiped clean. Memory has a habit of staging its own revisions. I didn't buy it. I told myself it was superstition, but the truth was simpler. I no longer needed to hold the book. The words had already done what they came to do. Outside, Oxford turned in on itself. Students crossing the High with that blend of hurry and arrogance. Tourists trailing behind spires like sheep through mist. The bells rang from Magdalen with their usual mournful precision. Not for ceremony, just for rhythm. Back in my flat, I found the crossword I'd left unfinished 3 nights before. The kettle clicked on, the room smelled faintly of tobacco and paper, the kind of scent that doesn't ask to be aired out. Clue 5 down, a place neither fully left nor fully returned to, 6 letters. I wrote in Oxford, almost without thinking, then crossed it out. Too obvious, too sentimental. I thought of Heloise again, not her face. That had blurred already, like all faces do when tied too tightly to language. But her voice, the shape of it, the pauses where confession would have sat had she been less intelligent. The way she spoke of exile not as punishment, but as preservation. Lewis had called earlier, voice lowered out of habit, though there was nothing left to hide. Marsh had gone quietly, offered no resistance, said he wanted to preserve the college's dignity, said almost wryly that he hoped I would make something literary of it. I said I'd try not to, but I failed. I always do. In the final report, I wrote nothing of the footnote, nothing of the ink that wasn't Calthorpe's, nothing of the wine glass polished by hands that did not drink, just the bare necessities. A death, a trespass, a confession of circumstance, not motive. Strange signed off with his usual brevity. Said it would all go quiet now. I told him that nothing truly quiets in Oxford. It only buries itself beneath older noise. Before filing the manuscript away for evidence, the last of it, I took a photo of the final page, not the words, really, just the margin. The space where the missing footnote should have been. A blank that still spoke louder than any citation. There's a kind of loneliness in academic rooms after closure, when the chair is pushed in too neatly, when the windows have been cleaned, when the manuscript is bound and boxed, but no one waits to read it. I went back to St. Fridarswide's once more, late, after the chapel lights had gone dim and the quad held only its own memory. The cleaner passed me without a word, just nodded. She'd seen the lilies return. Someone had placed a fresh pot near the door to Calthorpe's rooms, this time unbroken, this time without gloves. As I left, I passed a student rehearsing a monologue in the cloister. Exile is not absence, but movement without a rival. A line perhaps from something modern. Or perhaps not. I walked on, past the river, past the towers that no longer struck the hour for me. Past the window where Heloise once sat with her tea, with her book, with her choice. Because in the end, exile isn't a sentence. It's a decision made quietly to stand at the edge of a life and not step back in. And perhaps, without knowing, I'd made it too.